All right. I think maybe we should go back to Melancholia first and do some reading of that, and then go on to addressing the consumability of difference and how that is different from the other. Um, because there were a bunch of questions about last week too about what Han means about the narcissism of depression and also for me there's a question of like how he's making a distinction or not between melancholia and depression, which in the tradition he's working in are two very different things. So if we can start possibly with a kind of Freudian foundation of what these terms, where these terms are coming from. Freud says, um, oh, sorry, I guess I'm going to have to start with grief and melancholy. So Freud says grief is um, a healthy process of removing libido, removing eros from the lost object, right? The thing that is being grieved or the person that's being grieved, and transferring that eros to something else. So um, this kind of fits with what we typically think of as, you know, acceptable grief, which is um, people over time uh, being less focused on loving the thing that is lost and um, gaining or fostering or kind of um, caring for new desires. Um, One of the things I've noticed over time as in my grief, my wife passed away a couple of years ago, and the the thing that I noticed right away is that there are some people who uh, expect you to get over grief, and there's some people who think of grief as never ending. Um, so societally, at least in this country, grief is supposed to be short lived, and people are supposed to kind of move on from it. We also have a kind of fixed period of grief, kind of revolving around ceremonies of awake and funeral, and um, though the kind of period, the acceptable period of grief differs quite a bit from culture to culture. Um, my wife died in Korea. She was Korean, and um, the even the funeral itself, or the wake, I guess you would say, um, was kind of designed more to like allow for crying and wailing. Like for all of her family, so like me and the kids and her mom and sisters and her brother-in-law, and we had to stay in the funeral hall, and it's set up so that there's like a kind of room that you can sleep in. um, there's kind of food and drinks constantly coming and going, and you just stay around the body for 3 straight days, in this, you know, like safety net of family, or like a kind of designated space of grief. Um, though kind of after that, I felt like the designated space was gone, and it was quite a shock to kind of have to return to the real world. But um, it's different for different places, and should say something about acceptability. And so Freud, like I mentioned in class, right, he said basically that he could cure that the talking cure could help with neurotic neurosis, right? Which is to say, for Freud, that means kind of socially unacceptable or culturally unacceptable um, neurosis. So that, like, this was kind of pre looking into brains and understanding that certain chemicals kind of are responsible for different even different kind of feelings, right? So Freud kind of thought of it all as like a steamworks or something, um, in there, somewhere in there, pipes and steam moving around, and like we get the kind of blow off steam from that, right? Freud actually thought, like I mean, not literally, but that by letting off a kind of steam, um, you could reduce the pressure, psychic pressure. But this is just to say, okay, so that melancholy is unlike grief. It's a kind of a neurotic. It's a neurotic process of grief in which the transfer of eros uh, doesn't really happen, right? So that the person grieving continues to desire love, the the lost thing, person, whatever. And this is maybe closer to depression, but it's not really what depression is, even in a kind of pre uh, pre biological sense of it. Maybe pre modern or a sense of it, because I guess it was always kind of biological, just like attached to different liquids in your body or whatever. We used to have strange biological ideas of how depression worked. Um, Not that they're not strange now, I guess, but seem at least more scientifically based. The If we go to Melancholia, here we go. You've got in recent years, the end of love has been announced many times. Love, the claim goes, is founded because of endless freedom of choice, the overabundance of options, and the compulsion for perfection. And we've kind of touched on this in class, right? That's this, like, to think of love as like the one soulmate out there who's totally perfect for you, and like, you look through the sea of fishes or whatever until you find the one fish for you, um, the one perfect fish for you. Maybe fish is like a bad metaphor, but that's fine. um, this is maybe not the healthiest idea of love, and Han recognizes that, but what he what he really is concerned about is not so much um, the overabundance of choices, but um, the well, here he says the erosion of the other, right? And so this will be helpful to us in trying to understand what he means by that kind of consumability of difference, versus an inconsumable otherness. Um, so there's some delineation between these two things. Um, Chris kind of touched upon this while he was talking about difference and otherness too. The the erosion for Han, right, is occurring in all spheres of life, and its corollary is the mounting narcissification of the self. Um, so here's where narcissism comes in for Han. It's not so much the kind of technical sense of narcissism. It's more the idea that what matters in Eros is the self and not the other, right? So the narcissification of the self in relation to Eros, and um, for him, that's about consumability, and we'll come back to this. But the the narcissism here is kind of what his main beef would be with Carson, and what kind of our main beef has been with Carson, in that um, the only thing that seems to matter to, well, not to her, but to kind of Greek understanding of desire is um, its danger to the solidity or perceived solidity of the self. Um, so that, like, the Greek idea of desire um, in some ways represents a kind of consumability in which right, the other becomes uh, the pursuit object, and the self, you know, it's all about kind of the self reaching out toward that, and the self being changed by the self's love of the other. Um, and it's very little, as we saw, right? Very little about the beloved, the other themselves. So this is what Han would all call like the vanishing of the other. Though it's interesting that he thinks of it as contemporary, when we can see from Carson, right, that it's quite an old idea. Um, but it seems very closely linked to kind of individualism and this idea of individual freedom that is actually much more a kind of narcissification of the self, or at least Han would say so. Um, Eros concerns the other in the strong sense, namely what cannot be encompassed by the regime of the ego. So we talked about this sentence in class too, that if we're thinking about what the other is, it's inherently not the self, right? So it's inherently not narcissistic, is the way Han would use narcissism. The other escapes the boundaries of the self. The other cannot be understood. The other is, has its own self, uh, and so that selfhood. I mean, the danger of Eros is the desire to consume the selfhood of the other, right, and to kind of like incorporate it into the selfhood of the self, into your own selfhood. Um, this for Han, like the consumability of difference is also linked to this, like what he calls the inferno of the same. Um, and that difference, kind of loses its mysteriousness, its otherness, and becomes a thing that you can consume into the self. So that, like, um, and this is the kind of sameness too that Olivia was touching on. Um, Erotic experience presumes this asymmetry and exteriority of the other. So that's what he's saying, right? The other is out there. It is not by chance that Socrates, the lover, is called a topos, so placeless, right? The other is placeless. The other whom I desire and who fascinates me is placeless. He or she is removed from the language of sameness. Being a topic, the other makes language indecisive. One cannot speak of the other, about the other. Every attribute is false, painful, erroneous, awkward. And you experience this in love, maybe quite intensely, in that it's, if somebody asks you to like explain why you love someone, or to like tell them about your beloved, it's quite hard, actually. um, the other that you love is kind of so outside of the self, and that's, ideally what you love. um, that is very difficult to kind of encapsulate the other into symbols. I mean, that's right, it's unsymbolizable. um, and the self is all about symbolization, right, as we saw with Lacan. So we are constantly comparing one thing to another, thereby flattening them into the same, precisely because we no longer experience the atopia of the other. The negativity of the atopic other refuses consumption. So here's the same kind of wording going on. Um, this comparison, if we think of difference in terms of like you go to the supermarket and there's like 40 different kinds of toothpaste. Um, they're very like they have these small differences, but they're toothpaste. This this is a kind of no otherness. It's this, like it's a kind of very literal consumable difference. Um, and it's what we ask of consumption is this kind of slight differentiation that is all really a kind of inferno of the same. The negativity of the topic author refuses consumption. Therefore, the society of the consumer endeavors to eliminate a topic otherness in favor of consumable heterotopic differences. This is what I'm talking about. In contrast to otherness, difference is positive, right? So the basic difference for Han is difference is positive, otherness is negative. Um, if you think of the kind of the self is like you could think of it maybe like as a magnet or something, right? The the self, which is its own kind of otherness to other people, is negative, and so um, it attracts, and it pulls toward it, and it kind of connects and becomes one with difference. Maybe this is a terrible metaphor, but the other is negative and in kind of necessitates space between it. Like it never can kind of enter the magnetic orbit of the self. Um, Today, negativity is disappearing everywhere. Everything is being flattened out into an object of consumption. Today, we live in an increasingly narcissistic society. So, what he means is this next sentence: libido, um, for Freud, this is, desire, right? Eros, all the things we've kind of been talking about as Eros, is primarily invested in one's own subjectivity. Narcissism is not the same as self love. So, this sentence should kind of clear up some of the difficulty that we're thinking of when he's saying um, depression is narcissistic. Though the other part of that is our understanding of depression as a kind of biological state, and that's not right. That's not how Han is talking about depression. He's kind of talking about it more as an emotion and less as a kind of um, mental state or condition, right? The subject of self love draws a negative boundary between him or herself and the other. The narcissistic subject, on the other hand, never manages to set any clear boundaries. So the difference is self love is very clear about the boundary between the self and the other, right? What is me, I love. What is other, I hate. This is, you can see this all the time, right? The narcissistic subject, however, thinks of kind of everything in the inferno of the same, right? All difference is consumable. Everything is kind of up for consumption by the self. Um, in consequence, the border between the narcissist and the other becomes blurry. The other isn't allowed to have otherness, right? That's what narcissism is for Han. The the other is not allowed to be mysterious because the narcissistic self believes that it should be able to have access to everything, understand everything, have power and ownership over everything. Um, and this is like for Han, this is like the promise of Western imperialist capitalism. Um, it's it's this like it's this feeling that you have the right to do whatever you want, to own whatever you want, right? To make everything that you want yours. Um, and in his theory, this extends, right? Like the kind of capitalism of all of this, also, and imperialism of this, also extends to just how we kind of care about and desire other people. And this is this is what he's talking about, even when he goes, into the porn essay, though it's where he's talking about. the pornographication of eros, which is to say, like the consumability of eros, right? It's an eros that is kind of all performative, um, and is made for the consumption of the self. You don't need an other actually at all. Um, the pornography is kind of entering sexuality, a kind of dead sexuality to Han, into the orbit of the self, right? So that like um, you can watch porn on your own, and all of that kind of eroticism is a kind of false eroticism, a kind of narcissism. Um, a consumable eroticism. Without a world to inhabit, it has been abandoned by the other. Eros and depression are opposites. So, okay, eros and depression are opposites. Um, we should take this as helping us to understand what Han is talking about as depression. So, one way to think of depression is the absence of want, right? And this is what it has in common with melancholia, or not in common, but it's how it's related. So that um, when you are melancholic, you want something that is impossible to have. Um, right? Something is lost to you, and you know that it is impossible to um, it's like an impossible desire to satisfy, and yet you continue wanting that and wanting it instead of other things. um, Depression is at the other end, like say on a spectrum between eros and melancholia and depression. Depression is not wanting anything. um, and one of the symptoms of depression, kind of um, even clinical depression, is like a absence of desire, like an absence of the thoughts of the future, which is also like in the Carson way, reach that generates desire. Um, so like, I think Elliot was saying in class, right? People who are very depressed and suicidal, right? Like in the time in which they have a clear plan for the future, um, often appear very happy. Um, right, it's a time in which they're reaching for something. As a time in which they have a clear and attainable desire. Um, and and though this is not the kind of biological thing that is happening, what it is for Han is a kind of emotional, or a state of desire. Let's say that, a state of desire. So Eros pulls the subject out of itself toward the other. And this is kind of like his thesis of the book, right? It's the opposite of Carson's, or at least the Greek idea of desire. It's kind of like obliteration of the self. It's the opposite of narcissism. It's obliteration of the self, um, and this kind of pull toward the other. And Han thinks of this, like as we saw later in the next chapter, as a kind of like cycle, maybe is a way to think of it. Like you obliterate the self, you invest in the other, and by investing in the mystery of the other, you also kind of are able to constitute the self in a better and more loving way. um, I mean, one thing I've been thinking about a lot since I've been writing, I was supposed to write an essay about Asian American masculinity, um, is like uh, the obliteration of the self, but also like, see, now I'm missing it. Oh, is the Lacanian idea, right? That we kind of talked about briefly in the first week, that the self's, your desire, our desire, a person's desire is actually the desire of the other, right? And remember that kind of photo of the woman over, a lake or whatever, or a bunch of words, right, that said, um, that were basically the desire of the other, uh, in which formed desires. You can think of it as like, you know, um, your friend wants to introduce you to somebody who could be a possible um, partner, and you get ready for this encounter, thinking of the ways in which how you can make yourself desirable uh, to the other's desire, right? To this other person's desire. And, especially if you don't know that person, the idea of what is desirable to the other is actually, like a lot the idea of what is desirable to the other on a kind of large scale, like societal scale, in which, right, we like there's a kind of normative convention of beauty, there's a kind of normative convention of desirability or attractiveness, um, and the kind of less specific the other is, sometimes the more of this kind of normative general thing becomes the kind of the other's desire that we think of, or the way that we make ourselves desirable to the other. And you have to work kind of hard at this in order to um, tell yourself a story that changes who the other is, right? You don't actually change so that your desire becomes um, divorced from the other's desire. You start to understand who the other is to you, and it's not like a kind of um, societal um, heteronormativity or something. It becomes a more specific like community or something, right? You you understand your desire within the desire of a smaller community of people, um, maybe who dress a certain way or talk a certain way, or like whatever, read certain books or so on and so forth. um, so you're still kind of constructing your desire from the desire of the other, um, but as you better understand who the other is, and ideally in love, right, you have like a specific other then, um, and like the beauty of love for Han, or not beauty, but like beautiful agony of love, is in the kind of in the creation of the self, in the desire of the other, so that like you have this other in mind, but they are actually totally mysterious, right? Like you can never actually know another person. Though of course you can know many things about the other person, and even like anticipate how they would think or whatever, right? The better that you know them. Um, but you never occupy the other's position. And the desire to do so is exactly what we found distasteful in the Greek concept of desire, right? The desire to occupy the position of the other, or kind of consume the difference of the other. This is what Han is against. So instead he wants you to kind of lose yourself in that unknowableness of the other. Um, and that is agony, because it is unknowable, and because the self, like kind of loses its firmness. um you may lose your idea of who you are, right? And that's what the Carson was saying the Greeks were so against, that Socrates was not against, but and like that Socrates was fighting against, that the kind of popular Greek opinion of desire was, fuck desire, it like makes me feel like I'm not myself, right? um and Socrates, who knew that he didn't know himself, right, believed that that kind of losing of the self, like Han, was also a kind of gaining of the self. And so Han kind of thinks of it on the other side of that, that you kind of end up with a better idea of of yourself, as well as a kind of like a better appreciation of the other's otherness. Um, the opposite of that is the kind of consumption of the other, um, which is to say, like, it could be as simple as like thinking you thinking you know exactly what the other wants. And so, like, instead of asking them, instead of asking your partner, you know, what to do about this certain thing, you just go ahead and do it. And then you're like, oh, I did this thing for you. And your partner's like, well, like you didn't even ask me first, like, or it could be something like, um, or it could be kind of, more extreme, like a kind of, domestic abuse when when your partner doesn't succeed to your wishes or something, right? So this is a kind of like full idea of possession and consumption of the other. Um, and this is the danger, right? This is the danger of desire, as we've seen kind of both in Carson and in Han. Depression, depression is what Han is putting on the other side from Eros, right? It's not wanting. It's plunging the subject into itself. So um, when Emily, I think, Emily was saying like that the narcissism is not so much like the depressive person, but rather the nature of depression itself. That that is kind of what that is more like what Anna is saying, right? Depression itself plunges the subject into itself, right? Depression is a kind of state of narcissism to Han, um, in not in the biological sense, but in the sense that um, the kind of the ideal state then is a state of full kind of completion, possession, in which one wants nothing. Um, so it's like the obliteration of the self within the self rather than the other. Um, or maybe kind of within societal standards of desire, which is, here he's saying, right, the achievement subject seeks out success above all. We follow these kind of societal standards of desire that are often about kind of um, owning as much as you can, etc. Um, in this kind of model of desire, the other is robbed of otherness and degrades into the mirror of the one, a mirror affirming the latter's image. So if we go back to the Lacanian mirror stage, I don't know if you remember this, but it's also like the image of our course in Moodle. There's an image. The image I showed you was like a baby looking into the mirror and understanding, for the first time, that the reflection was it, but also understanding then that it is that the baby, the self, will always be kind of separated, um, from the, right, like the image of the other, the imagined self is separate from the actual self. Um, in the depression model that Han is talking about, that is a kind of a model in which the mirror disappears again, right? And like a baby, the world is there just to kind of affirm the self's desires, right? That, we talked about how the baby's desire, um, in a psychoanalytic way is oneness, is this kind of, but not oneness as in like shared oneness as in just the self, right? And that's the kind of narcissism that Han is talking about. It's where there's no difference between people, and so nobody is an other, everything is the same, everything is part of the self. So that like when I am hungry, I the baby am hungry, I think, everything is hungry, right? And when I the baby, um, you know, have gas or something, I think, oh, like the world is so uncomfortable. Um, Rather than understanding myself as a self, which means a boundary between the self and others. Um, I feel like that's pretty much where we're going here. And as he goes into the movie itself, um, the argument kind of becomes like the same, but also like less interesting, maybe, especially if you haven't seen the movie. So we'll kind of jump from there into the end here, which I asked you to think about. Otherness is not consumable difference. So, I feel like a closer reading of Melancholia, um, hopefully allowed a better understanding of also of this phrase, otherness is not consumable difference. Um, and and like, I say this in class, but there's a theory of humanity that goes, right. What separates humans from other animals is that humans have the negative, right? They have a topos. They have um, this sense that something is not something else, right? That um, my computer is not a tree. For other animals, a computer is a computer. They're not thinking of it as not something else, right? And that becomes really important to language, um, to symbolization, right? When we think that the meaning words get is from their difference from other words. Um, and it also becomes really important to kind of like what makes something mine and not yours, or what makes like something itself and not another thing, is its kind of negative quality. The kind of consumable difference that he's talking about, he's putting these two things at odds, right? Otherness is not consumable difference. Otherness is negative. As we saw, difference is positive. Because it is positive, it is consumable by the self. So it can be kind of captured within the realm of the ego, um, within the symbolic realm, right? And the otherness is beyond symbolization. It's beyond the imaginative. We do it a disservice to think we know it and to kind of make it into an imagined version of it, that is about the self, right? And not about the other. Um, if we think about consumable difference, consumable difference is always about making that kind of image of the self's image of the thing, of the difference. um it's why commercials work, right? It's the commercial depicts a kind of maybe to go back to the desire of the other, right? A kind of more ideal other who has a more ideal desire, and the thing that it wants is this object that is consumable by the self. And in consuming it, the self is able to imagine itself as the more ideal version of it. This is how all commercials are working. So um, for Han, as we're gonna see, he's thinking of also of like, like pornography as a kind of consumable eroticism and consumable sexuality and um like self-help books as consumable ways of thinking about the self formation and um like clothes that we buy as consumable ways of forming ourselves as desirable in the eyes of the other, et cetera, et cetera. um I don't know if I just confused it at the end or made it make more sense. I kind of feel like I confused it more. So, um, but that's where it is, I guess. The Marissa mentioned like all of the kind of richness on page 12, and I totally am with it there. Like the right. That's why I wanted to talk mostly about being able not to be able. I think a lot of his best ideas are in this essay. Um, and also that he's kind of like clearer about those ideas in this essay, even though it's like it's not like super clear. um go to page 12. We see okay, this is like maybe approximately page 12. Eros is a relationship. I'm no, okay, that's page 11. Eros is a relationship to the other situated beyond achievement, performance, and ability. Being able to not to be able represents its negative counterpart, the negativity of otherness, right? Being able not to be able to understand the other, being able not to be able to consume the other, um, involves and necessitates a kind of letting go of the self, right? Letting go of our focus on kind of like making our selfhood clear to ourselves, or kind of steady and secure. Um, the agony of Eros is that you have to give up a clear, firm understanding of who you are in order to love better. Though the kind of sweetness at the end of it is in the return um, through the other to a better kind of relationship between self and other. Um, Today, love is being positivized into sexuality and by the same token, subjected to a commandment to perform. Um, Sex means achievement and performance, and sexiness represents capital to be increased. The body with its display value has become a commodity. That seems like something we can see a lot, and maybe explains why some people think they can govern other people's bodies. At the same time, the other is being sexualized into an object for procuring arousal. So, procuring arousal, right? That's about the self. And so, by sexualizing the other into an object for procuring arousal, the other is being made consumable by the self. When otherness is stripped from the other, right, that's what he's saying. When otherness is stripped from the other, one cannot love, one can only consume. It's like I could write this essay. To this extent, the other is no longer a person. Instead, he or she has been fragmented into sexual part objects. Right? The part objects, sexuality is consumable in a way like that. In a way that the mysterious otherness of a other human being um, is not consumable, or is only consumable in breaking the other down into its parts, right? To say, you know, we can legislate the womb, we can, legislate um, the work that you get done on your teeth, like the ways that the this country kind of breaks us into parts is the way in which this country makes us consumable. Um, this last line is a reference to Lacan, but it's not that important. Um, doo-doo-doo-doo. So I hope that this kind of helps a little bit in thinking about the stuff you guys have been thinking about. You have interesting questions, and as usual, I love kind of watching you work through things. The um, one thing Han maybe is not so good at is like is what we said in class, right? Not he doesn't like totally define his own terms. Um, Part of these essays task is in defining those terms, but he is not always so clear about what he means, especially kind of for an audience who isn't um, as versed in psychoanalytic theory as he is, which is probably most people. So, um, any questions about what he means by specific words or terms and how they differ from like more kind of official or more colloquial uses, right? Because either are often like not exactly what Han is talking about. Um, and then like also the question of translation comes into. I actually don't know how much of this the difficulty with the wording is in translation and like trying to find a term that matches up with what he is saying in German. So that might be part of it as well. Um, in that a kind of translator's difficult duty of trying to make the specificity of another language into um, something consumable to people who are reading in a different language. Um, so, but I think where Han and Carson agree though is is in like maybe the in the sweetness of the bitterness, right? In the idea that desire can't be a kind of like a consumable pleasantry. It can't be all like um, pleasant and uh, understandable. There's a part of desire that has to be mysterious and has to be and has to kind of shake loose your sense of yourself. And um, that bitterness, which the Greeks found so bitter, and that also our achievement society, our capitalism sees as so bitter, um, is actually the kind of sweetness of Eros. Uh, and that as we're living and loving and desiring, we're constantly breaking down who we are. If we're kind of like really loving, we're breaking down who we are because we're breaking down our sense of the other's desire and our sense of like the boundaries between self and others, our sense of understanding of other people, and in entering the kind of scariness, I think sometimes of the kind of void of understanding that is otherness. Um, we come to change ourselves uh, and make ourselves better. The I think you can think of plenty of examples of people who refuse to kind of enter the void of the other, right? Who think of the other as if they already understand exactly who the other is, whether it's via stereotypes or um, kind of flash judgments or societal standards and norms, um, instead of an otherness that will kind of take away a sense of the self or change the sense of the self. Some people don't want their selves to be changed at all, right? And that means instead of kind of entering into that negativity, they want only positive, consumable difference. And that means then that the difference is not really difference at all, right? It's an image, it's a self-made image. Um, so that like the kind of like a stereotype of somebody becomes who they are to a person who is not willing to enter into the negativity of the otherness, um, because the stereotype is easier for the self to incorporate, to consume. And um, I think the really important point that Han is making is that is in this kind of idea of the negativity of the other, the idea that we really have to accept, um, and lean into the bitterness, like the mystery, and the dissolution of our own ideas. Um, we have to be willing to kind of break ourselves down and break our understanding of ourselves down, um, in order to kind of love truly, and in order to for that love to kind of really change who we are. Um, I think that at least Han and Carson would have in common, um, and probably the other people that we will be reading as well. So, looking forward to talking about this in class. Thanks for thanks to those who shared.